G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. I'm in the middle of restoring a set of heirloom oars. They were the oars to the boat that my father kept in a little shed beside his holiday house at Red Rock. And before I was born or thought of, my brother and sisters would have been using these oars, I'm pretty certain. I started using these oars when I was 6 years old. Back in those days, it was considered pretty acceptable if your kid knew how to work a set of oars and knew how to swim. You just put them in the boat and said, you know, don't go any closer to the mouth of the river than the shop is, and stay where you can see the house. And if you can see the house, we can see you in the boat. And if you get into a wind and tide combination that you're not strong enough to row home, just row to the nearest riverbank and tie the boat up and walk home. We can always get a new boat. We can't get a new kid, so, you know, don't feel too bad if you have to let the boat sink. We'll go and get it tomorrow after the storm's passed. So yeah, these are the oars that brought me home safe every time. And before I got married, the holiday house was sold, so I didn't actually put my kids through the regular nautical experience of rowing boats and stuff. But now that my son's a businessman, he's treated himself to buying a little boat, and the oars that came with it were just horrible, absolutely horrible. Plastic curved sculls on the end of wooden dowels. Yucky poo. So I'm restoring the oars, which I remember really well from when I was a kid and we had a house at the coast. Back in the days when I was a hunting, shooting, fishing, meat eating style of a kid. And there's a tiny little bit of the transom of the old boat. Before I got a boat of my own, an 8-foot sabot with a bowsprit and a jib. And that's the Red Bank Creek estuary where I learnt to sail after I learned to row, before I did what all teenage boys do and discovered that the beach is a pretty good place to meet girls. Red Rock 1964, back when the fishing was seriously good. Fish is a foot long. Guess how long the lobster is on the 7-foot long door. So here's where the project is at the moment. The oars have been sanded. One, of course, as you see, has had its first coat of varnish. I took the old copper cladding off the tips, discovered that underneath the copper cladding they'd once had red painted tips. I filled in the dings with araldite and wood flour, and I sheathed the tips in aluminium and then painted the sheathings or the caps red. One has had its first coat. So now I'm going to show you my method of varnishing a laminated oar without getting any suspension marks on the oar. It involves using my grandfather's G-clamps, or G-clamp, one of my G-clamps, and my grandfather's forge welded spoke lathe ends, from which I can suspend the oar. And voila, we have the oar in position, ready for the varnish, suspended on 2 points. Didn't go entirely perfectly because yesterday I had trouble centering the lathe on the oar. So today I thought I'd centre punch a mark and the paint cracked. And I've had to try and use varnish to glue the paint chips back in there. So, not entirely 100% successful, but the oar is now gimbaled and it may be turned freely around its long axis for varnishing. I think somebody once said, a rolling stone gathers no moss. Well, if you move 7 times every generation, how are you going to use your grandfather's spoke lathe and clamp when you're restoring your father's oars to pass on to your son? The Aboriginal view is that it takes 7 generations living on one landscape before you fully fit in. But I'm pretty pleased with this rig. An heirloom coach building rig for restoring heirloom laminated oars. I was going to use Feast Watson's Spa varnish, flexible oil varnish with UV protection, but turns out that in the 1970s, last time the old man restored these oars, maybe late 60s, he used polyurethane varnish on them. So I went and bought some polyurethane exterior clear, marine grade. So it says. That's why it's in a Vegemite jar diluted with about 30% turpentine for the first coat. And the brush is clean, having been cleaned with the appropriate method. Okay, we have about 8 minutes left on the upload limit. I think I should be able to get somewhere quite close to doing it in that. The crack about the paintbrush being cleaned in the appropriate manner probably should be explained. My old man had some funny ideas on raising children. His first wife said to him when they got married that if she ever caught him giving her kids a belting the way he used to use a whip on his little brother, she'd leave him. So my father was never allowed to beat the kids of his first marriage. My brother and my 2 half-sisters. Apparently he had a go at raising his hand to my youngest sister after her mother had died. As he lifted his hand up, the back of his hand ran into the pointy end of a plastic set square sticking out of a shelf on the cupboard that was behind him. Tore the skin off the back of his hand. And spiritualists would probably say that his first wife might have had something to do with that. So anyway, when I come along, I was pretty much literally raised to the tune of a Stockwhip, in the sense that when I was 3 years old, I was taking my pedal car out on the road, and I wouldn't listen to my mother because I kept telling her that it's a car and you drive cars on the road, and that's what the road's there for, Mum. So she contacted the old man by the telephone, and he came home via the saddlers, and he bought himself a brand new Stockwhip at the saddlers. He used to come home for lunch every day in those days. Wasn't such an unusual thing in a little country town, particularly for a businessman. To shut up the workshop and go home for 3/4 of an hour or so. So anyway, he curls this Stockwhip around his dinner plate, and I'm furiously curious at age 3, and he wouldn't answer any questions on it. And he always finished his meal with bread and butter and jam. Because when he was a kid, you could have bread and butter, or you could have bread and jam. Well, they weren't actually rich enough to have bread and butter and jam. So part of how he enjoyed being prosperous and affluent was having his bread and butter and jam. And when he'd finally finished his bread and butter and jam, he picks up the Stockwhip and he says, "Come with me and I'll show you how I crack the whip." And I thought he was joking, because the only meaning I assigned for the word crack in those days was to break something, crack an egg. And I knew he never broke anything. So I thought he had to be joking with me. He goes outside, and we had in the backyard an apple tree. And the apple tree, oh dear. The apple tree was in fruit. That oh dear was because the spindle just slipped on the end of the oar. Going to make for a very messy ending on this one. So he goes out there and he swings this Stockwhip thingy around his head, and there's an almighty loud bang like a gun going off, and one of the apples fell off the tree and landed on the ground. And I looked at it and I couldn't understand what had happened. I was 3. And he did this swinging the thing around his head trick again, and there was another almighty bang, and the apple jumped into 2 halves, just as neatly as if you'd cut them with a knife. And then real fast he did it again 2 more times, and the 2 halves, they became quarters. And he looked at me, and he curled the whip up, and he held it in his hands in front of me, and he said, "Now, if I ever hear of you taking your pedal car out on the road again, I'm going to put this around your ass just like I put it around those apples. Do you understand me?" "Yes, Daddy." So, ever afterwards, when it was dinner time, and I was off riding the streets of Glen Innes with my fox terrier dog to keep me company, if I heard 3 cracks of a Stockwhip, me and the dog would race each other to see who could be the first to get around the corner and go up the gutter, because we had been summoned. It was loud enough that at Red Rock, the old man used the Stockwhip one day to call me and the dog to come home for dinner, and the New South Wales policeman, who was in the next house, half asleep, fell off the couch, jumped up into the sky. He thought it was a gunshot. And there was an occasion when me and the dog were up at the high school, because in those days kids were allowed to ride their bikes around in the high school as long as there was no vandalism done. You know, it was a good place to get them off the road so the drunk drivers didn't kill them, because there was no random breath testing and no actual speed limits on the open road in those days either. Yeah, as we come around the corner, there's a strange car in the driveway, and there was my father and his brother. And there was 17 years between them, and Dad used to, as I said, built his kid brother. And the kid brother's standing there and he's turning red and blue and white. And his face was changing colour as he watched my father show him how he'd succeeded in training his new kid to come to the sound of a Stockwhip. Whereas my uncle, when he was a kid, he spent most of his childhood running from the sound of a Stockwhip. Until their mother died when my uncle was a young teenager, and they sent him to De La Salle College, Armidale. I got sent to De La Salle College, Armidale. My mother was still alive, still is. If she hadn't stored these oars in a garage for 20 odd years, I wouldn't have them today to be restoring them for my son to go and learn how much fun it is to mess around in boats. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. I think I've done reasonably well, and I will now go and clean the brush in the approved manner, as my father taught me to do the day he finally put the whip around me bum for doing it wrong. Ciao.